Welcome to a discussion of Sorry to Bother You. So, I think Sorry to Bother You is one of the best films, American films, bringing together the critique of racism and the critique of capitalism. So, oftentimes you get films like Glengarry Glen Ross or Citizen Kane that are great critiques of capitalism. And then there are other films like Do the Right Thing or Bamboozled, another Spike Lee film, that are amazing critiques of racism. But Sorry to Bother You really brings the two together and shows how to critique racism is already also to critique capitalism. So this is, I think, one of the things that really makes it stand out. The other thing that makes it stand out is it's an example of surrealist cinema that also is narrative cinema. So most surrealist films existed primarily early period of cinema. So 1920s was probably the high point of surrealism, but there are some within the narrative era, specifically the films of Louis Buñuel, like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie or Phantom of Liberty. Now, what's interesting about, say, Phantom of Liberty is it basically has no narrative at all. But Sorry to Bother You, it has a pretty important narrative through line. So there are surreal elements to it, but there's also, it's narrative cinema. So before getting to diving into Sorry to Bother You, I want to commence this discussion with which seems appropriate to me, with a joke about horse racing. So the joke goes like this. What's the best way to get a small fortune at horse racing? Start with a large fortune. So to me, it leads into the film because it's about the way in which capital promises you a lot and then actually takes away something from you. And that's what this film is really about. How the more Cassius earns, the more he loses something really important about himself. And I think that's what Detroit is in the film to remind him about. And that's what her art in the film is trying to accomplish. So Sorry to Bother You is, as I was saying, an exploration of the intersection of capitalist exploitation and racism. And what's fascinating about the film is that telemarketing represents the paradigm for contemporary capitalism. And I think that's a really correct analysis. I think the way that telemarketing functions, and this is what the director Boots Riley is getting at, is the main way in which contemporary capitalism functions. It invades us at every point. We're never free from it. And you never know when it's going to get you. You're going to hit by a telemarketer. And that invasiveness of capital is what Riley is really getting at with the focus on telemarketing. So the telemarketer invades private life and doesn't respect any kind of boundary. And I think one of the best parts about the film is the way it surrealistically captures this idea in its formal manifestation.
Hello?
So the film here, in this amazing scene where we see the telemarketer inserted into the sex scene, we see the film displaying what's happening psychically. That is, this insertion into the private existence of people. But the other thing that's fascinating is somebody's having sex and they answered their phone. So this is another way in which the film is showing how these aspects of contemporary capitalism seep into all of our entire existence, and we actually want it. Like, we answer the phone. Like, someone could just not pick up the phone, but she picks up the phone even though she's having sex because she thinks there's something better that might come on the phone. It turns out it's not better. So Cassius enters into the most private moments. We see him also entering into a guy sitting on the toilet and talking with him or having sex. So there is no more private moment because there's no more public realm. So telemarketing is part of the way in which capitalism destroys a public realm. At least the contemporary version of capitalism does that. And here we see this talking to the guy on the toilet. And what's interesting is we're just getting a visual representation of what happened psychically. So Riley uses this surreal juxtaposition. Obviously, no one actually goes into the bathroom with another person, but people do answer the phone when they're in the bathroom, which is bizarre, right? Like it's just a bizarre thing. So that's a. I think the film is doing a really good job of showing what's happening psychically in this case. So telemarketing success requires that Cassius insert himself in some prevailing fantasy structure, and that will ultimately mean learning to change his voice. So he's only successful once he begins to employ what he comes to call a white voice. And it's clear, so Riley it's actually someone else, a different actor, is speaking the voice. And it's clear that it's not Cassius who's actually talking. So the partial asynchrony of the dub is important to what the film is trying to suggest about the voice, that the voice is detached from the body, and it's that voice that's the source of the phantasmatic appeal that the telemarketer, Cassius in this case, is making. So, Sorry to Bother You shows this voice detached because the sound of the voice carries in it all of society's obscene, racist ideas. So that's what's interesting. So there's a whole fantasy structure around the voice that's tied into the racist structure of the society.
You bring a chick home to your apartment, it's clean, it's stylish.
So people are seduced by the voice because it seems filled with enjoyment, right? It fits into some fantasy structure that they have. And this is what Cassius is able to succeed at. That's what is the mark or the vehicle for his success as a telemarketer. And it shows him becoming successful by buying into the imperatives of the racist capitalism that his girlfriend Detroit and he himself was against at the beginning of the film. So it's really a film about the way in which racist capitalism gets its tentacles in even those who are trying to resist it. And he ends up being seduced by the appeal of great wealth. And the split with Detroit occurs precisely because Cassius has invested himself in capitalist success. And what he doesn't see, or he stops seeing, is the way in which that success is tied to what Detroit's earrings, in this case, say, murder and killing, that there's a violence to that capitalist success. And her art is actually an attempt to expose this universal selling out that occurs within capitalism. And that is why she is doing what she's doing in her artistic exhibition or her artistic performance. And you see her taking a lot of abuse in that performance because what she's trying to show is the sadism that's driving or that's activated by capitalist accumulation. So she's trying to say and reveal how there's a sadism intrinsic in capitalist society. And this sadism ultimately manifests itself in the show that Cassius goes on to expose what's happening with the worry-free corporation. It turns out exposing it doesn't do any good. He exposes it and it ends up being more popular, drives their stock price up. So the show is called I Got the Shit Kicked Out of Me. And Cassius goes on it and takes incredible abuse just to make this revelation. We see him here getting beaten up by guys, and then he has to actually allow his body to be covered in feces. And he does this all to make this revelation that ends up doing nothing. So it's Detroit, though, who tells Cassius capitalism basically started by stealing labor from Africans. So she makes the connection, even at the origin of capitalism, between racism and capitalist accumulation. And she understands that his job as telemarketer, as what he's selling, which is basically selling slavery, that he's morally emaciated because he's selling slave labor. So she's the figure, I think, the ethical figure in the film who pulls Cassius out of his capitalist death spiral, we might say. And this company that he ends up working for, Worry Free, is attempting to create the perfect form of labor. So this is something capitalism is always in search of. How can we create labor or find a form of labor that will create value for us without costing us anything, or as little as, with costing us as little as possible. So the perfect labor would cost nothing and would create infinite value. So every other form of labor has to fit within that. And they want to maximize the value created and minimize the cost. So Worry Free initially creates a feudal system within the capitalist structure. So feudalism is the economic social system that capitalism replaces in Europe in the Middle Ages. And in the feudal system, serfs are attached to a feudal lord. And this is kind of what, not just kind of, it is what Worry Free is offering people. You get economic security for your political submission. And I think, in a way, that's the fundamental bargain that capital society is constantly offering us. That's what the film is claiming. So ultimately, the point of Worry Free is how can we produce more docile and more efficient laborers? And it's important, I think, that they choose a horse as the model, because the horse is seen as the model of docility and also of hard work, right? Like the figure of Boxer in George Orwell's Animal Farm is constantly working up to the point at which he's sent to a glue factory, and then he's not a bother anymore. So it's the interesting idea that in this search for the most docile and most efficient laborer, they turn to the horse. So creating Equisapiens is a way to stop revolt and to get more productive labor. So it's 2 for 1. So you get more productive labor and you get docility. And that's really what the capitalist is aiming at. So what's interesting about that is the link between the economic and the political. So in addition to creating Equisapiens, Steve Lift, who's played by Armie Hammer, wants to place a leader of the revolt among them in order to control the revolt. So he knows a revolt's going to come because every oppressed class revolts in some way. And yet he wants to be in charge even of the revolt. And the problem is, nicely anticipated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the problem is this. What the bourgeoisie produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. I'm not sure that Sorry to Bother You thinks it's inevitable, but the ending of the film does suggest that Steve Lift, in his attempt to create a more productive and docile labor, actually creates a class able to defeat him and destroy him. So the Equisapiens actually are the ones that lead this coalition of revolt against Worry Free and against the executive Steve Lift, and they're strong enough to be able to do it. Sorry to Bother You ends with the forces of capitalism actually driving the forces of revolutionary change. And that's what we get at the very end of the film. So it's an interesting, I think, compelling depiction of how capitalism, like Marx and Engels say, creates its own gravediggers, and it shows how that might be actually accomplished. So it does it, we get it done. We see Riley showing formally how the problems of capitalism and racism arise and have an effect. And then we get this formal depiction of the overthrow of capitalist society and a direction of where we might go to challenge it. It's an amazing ending of the film, and it's really one of the more radical endings. And Boots Riley himself, the director, said it's a happy ending because even though Cassius becomes a horse, he nonetheless, and he's meant to be a false flag. He's meant to be someone who will make the Equisapien revolt tame. It'll direct it in the right way for big capital. But actually, he leads the assault on the biggest capitalist of all, the stand-in for Jeffrey Bezos. But I think the fundamental lesson of the film is don't snort cocaine because it might turn you into a horse.